On December 21st, 1988, Pan Am Flight 103 was flying high above Scotland when it was just obliterated by a terrorist bomb. For a long time, until 9/11, this was the deadliest terror attack to ever involve Americans. So today, we're going to break down the incredible story of how a crime that happened at 31,000 feet was painstakingly solved, piece by tiny piece, right down on the ground. And the human cost of this attack, it was just staggering. You had 259 people on the plane, passengers and crew, and then another 11 people on the ground in the town of Lockerbie who lost their lives when the wreckage came down. That's a total of 270 victims. 270 families changed forever. So let's set the scene. It's Pan Am Flight 103, making its way from London to New York. It was just a few days before Christmas, so the plane was filled with people heading home for the holidays. That included 35 college students from Syracuse University coming back from a semester abroad. Then, at 7:03 p.m., right over the Scottish border, it just vanished from the radar screen. Now, that explosion created a challenge that was, well, almost unimaginable. The plane was shattered into thousands upon thousands of pieces, which then rained down over 850 square miles of Scottish countryside. For the investigators who arrived, this wasn't just a crash site. It was the largest, most complex crime scene in the entire world. I mean, where do you even begin? This is where the real detective story begins. It was like a forensic puzzle on a microscopic scale, and solving it was going to require a level of investigation that had, frankly, never been tried before. So the investigators started peeling this back layer by layer, almost like a giant, tragic onion. First, they found a 20-inch square hole in the plane's skin. It had pitting and black soot around the edges, a dead giveaway that this was a bomb that went off inside, not some kind of mechanical failure. From there, they traced the blast's origin point to one specific luggage container, AV4041. Sifting through the debris from that container, they found 56 little fragments of a brown, hard-sided Samsonite suitcase. And then, the final piece. Embedded in some of the charred clothing from that same suitcase were tiny bits of a Toshiba radio cassette player. They'd found it. That was the bomb. So, what was this bomb actually made of? Well, a chemical analysis of those container fragments found tiny traces of PETN and RDX. Now, those are the key ingredients in Semtex, a really powerful plastic explosive. Think of it like a chemical fingerprint. The science was becoming undeniable. But even with all of this amazing physical evidence, investigators were still missing that one direct link. You know, the one that could lead them to the person who actually built the bomb. And the breakthrough they so desperately needed? It came from a tiny piece of evidence no bigger than your fingernail. Get this. While examining the collar of a burnt-up shirt from that suitcase, a forensic scientist spots something. It's a tiny green fragment of a circuit board. After a massive global search, they identified it as a piece of an MST-13 timer, a really sophisticated device made exclusively by a single Swiss company called Mebo. This was huge. This wasn't just any old timer, it was a specific, traceable piece of tech, a direct line from the bomb to its maker. And that tiny little timer fragment, combined with the clothes it was literally embedded in, was about to lead investigators far, far away from the cold fields of Scotland, all the way to a small island nation in the middle of the Mediterranean. The investigation then zeroed in on all the clothes that had been packed inside that suitcase. You had a baby grow, the slalom shirt where they found the timer fragment, some Yorkie trousers. One by one, they were all traced back to a single clothing shop in Malta called Mary's House. I mean, the combination of items was just too specific, too random to be a coincidence. And sure enough, the shop owner, a man named Tony Gauchi, he remembered the sale. He told investigators that a Libyan man had come in and bought that exact oddball collection of clothes. And he said the guy seemed totally uninterested in the sizes or styles. He just bought the items. This testimony was the critical link. It connected all that physical evidence to an actual suspect, and it ultimately led to the indictment of 2 Libyan intelligence agents. So, the investigation had finally identified its main suspects. But finding them was one thing. Getting them into a courtroom? Well, that was about to turn this criminal case into a decade-long international crisis. So, in 1991, the US and the UK officially indicted the 2 Libyan agents. But Libya's leader at the time, Muammar Gaddafi, he flatly refused to extradite them.
He basically said, nope, not gonna happen. And just like that, a massive diplomatic standoff began. And this led to a really fascinating and pretty rare conflict right inside the United Nations. On one side, you had the UN Security Council, which passed resolutions demanding Libya surrender the suspects and hitting the country with crippling economic sanctions. But at the exact same time, Libya took its own case to the International Court of Justice, arguing that under an aviation treaty called the Montreal Convention, it actually had the right to try its own citizens. So you had two of the most powerful international bodies in a direct legal clash. This whole standoff just dragged on and on for years. Sanctions were imposed in '92, then tightened even more in '93, basically isolating Libya from the rest of the world. Finally, after almost a decade of tense negotiations, there was a breakthrough in 1999. Libya agreed to hand over the suspects for trial, but there was a huge condition attached. And that condition led to one of the most unique trials in all of modern history. They decided that a Scottish court operating under Scottish law would be held on neutral ground at a former U.S. airbase in the Netherlands called Camp Zeist. So the trial wrapped up in 2001. In the end, one of the accused, Lamin Khalifa Fimaha, was acquitted of all charges. But the other, Abdelbaset al-Megrahi, was found guilty on 270 counts of murder. Then, a couple of years later, in 2003, the Libyan government formally accepted responsibility for the bombing and agreed to pay more than $2 billion in compensation to the families of the victims. So, legally speaking, the case was closed. But the questions that the bombing raised about aviation security, well, those are still very much with us today. This event revealed some absolutely catastrophic failures in the system. Look, things have definitely changed since 1988. We now have things like passenger bag matching and much better explosive screening. But that fundamental question still hangs in the air. Have all the holes really been plugged? Well, according to security experts in government reports, there are still several really critical gaps. The insider threat is a big one. You know, the airport employees, like baggage handlers, who often get to bypass the same tough screening that passengers go through. Then you've got cargo. Millions of pounds of it are shipped on passenger planes every day, and a huge chunk of it isn't screened for explosives. And finally, the technology for bomb-resistant luggage containers actually exists, but airlines are really reluctant to use them because they're expensive and they add a lot of weight. And for the families of the victims, this fight for better security has never, ever stopped. Glenn Johnson, whose daughter Beth died on that flight, put it perfectly. He said, "We're acting as the conscience." They continue to advocate tirelessly just to make sure that the lessons of Lockerbie are never forgotten. The Lockerbie investigation was, without a doubt, a triumph of forensic science and international grit. But the tragedy itself leaves us with this huge, enduring dilemma. In a world that absolutely relies on the speed of global travel and commerce, how do we find that perfect balance between the need for total security and the constant demands that keep our modern world connected? It's a question we're still trying to answer.